The mass politics practiced since 1917 are simply an extension of total war by other means, if I may be allowed to convert Clausewitz's definition of war as diplomacy carried on by other means. The political use made of the term front at once shows this. You know what, I see I already read that, so let's move on. I wrote in 1938, quote, Hitler's success with the German masses may seem surprising, but a non-German would be quite as much astonished by the kind of behavior that pleases German women. The Latins woo a woman by turning her head with flattering talk, and it is likewise with a flood of flattering talk that French politicians woo their voters. Hitler is more rough and ready. He expresses anger and grievances in the same breath. He does not persuade. He casts a spell. Conjuring up destiny, he asserts that this destiny is himself. He thus releases the masses from responsibility for their conduct, and hence he rids them of any oppressive sense of moral guilt. The crowd surrenders to the dread savior and hails him as its liberator in the very moment he paralyzes and possesses it. We should note that the popular term in Germany for getting married is freien, a verb which means literally to free. Hitler is presumably only too well aware of this. There is, he writes, something so thoroughly feminine about the attitude and reactions of the great majority of the common people that its opinions and conduct are the result of feeling far more than of pure cogitation. Let me repeat that. There is something so thoroughly feminine about the attitude and reactions of the great majority of the common people that its opinions and conduct are the result of feeling far more than of pure cogitation. The masses are not very susceptible to abstract ideas. On the other hand, they are easily gripped by an appeal to emotion. In all ages, the force that has launched the most violent revolutions has not been the announcement of some scientific idea which seized the crowd, but a fanaticism that stimulated it, and an actual hysteria which infected it with wild enthusiasm. Yes, this has been so in all ages, but the novelty today is that this passionate influence over the masses described by Hitler is accompanied by a rationalizing influence over individuals. Furthermore, this influence is not obtained by some agitator, but by the leader who incarnates the nation. That is why the transference of passion from private to public life has resulted in an unprecedented concentration of power. It will need a superhuman Wagner to orchestrate the stupendous catastrophe of passion become totalitarian. End of quote. We are brought to the verge of a conclusion that I was far from foreseeing when I began this book. The gradual transformation which the European myth of passion underwent proves to have taken the same course alike in the history of methods of warfare and in the history of literature. And in both cases, the transformation culminated in an aspect which receives too little notice. I mean, the dissolution of the formal modes instituted by chivalry. In literature, throwbacks occur, but in the realm of war, every change is irreversible. And it is in this realm that the need of providing a fresh solution first became evident. The answer of the 12th century was courtly chivalry, with its romantic morality and myths. The answer of the 17th century is symbolized in French classical tragedy. The answer of the 18th was Don Juan's cynicism and rationalist irony. But Romanticism was no answer unless, and this is possible, its eloquent surrender to the nocturnal forces of the myth is regarded as an ultimate attempt to enfeeble the myth by deliberate excess. However that may be, the defense was hardly proportionate to the peril simultaneously let loose. The anti-vital forces long dammed up by the myth then overflowed into the most various spheres, so that there followed a dissociation, using the word in the exact sense of a severance of the bonds that hold society together. And yet I feel that to allow all passion to be absorbed by the nation can prove no more than an emergency measure. The menace may be held off for the time being, but it is also being made to weigh permanently upon the very lives of those peoples who have thus been formed into solid masses. No doubt the totalitarian state is a newly devised formal mode, but one too vast, too rigid, and too geometrical for the complex lives of human beings, however militarized, to be successfully shaped and organized within its framework. Police measures do not constitute a culture or slogans of morality. Between the artificial framework of great states and the everyday life of men and women, the gap is too wide, so that restlessness and uncertainty are greater than ever. Nothing is really settled. It is possible that we shall have total atomic war, spiritual and moral disintegration, and the problem of passion together with the civilization that brought this problem into existence. It is possible that we shall have total atomic war, spiritual and moral disintegration, and the problem of passion together with the civilization that brought this problem into existence will vanish in smoke. But it seems to me more likely that the problem will arise again in totalitarian countries, even as it has never ceased to exercise us, who belong to liberal societies. In the two concluding books of this work, accordingly, I treat the problem as still active. The first of them deals with a conflict in our manners between the myth and the institution of marriage. The second sums up an attitude which I put forward less as a final answer than as what I have chosen for myself. Book 6, The Myth versus Marriage. The breakdown of marriage. The Middle Ages had two rival moral systems. One upheld by Christianized society, the other the product of heretical courtesy. The first took marriage for granted and even made it into a sacrament. The second promoted a set of values in the light of which, at any rate theoretically, marriage was a mistake. The attitude of each to adultery clearly indicates their mutual antagonism. In the eyes of the Church, adultery was at one and the same time a sacrilege, a crime against the natural order, and a crime against the social order, for the sacrament conjoined in one and the same act two faithful souls, two bodies capable of begetting, and two juridical persons. It was therefore a sacrament that made holy the fundamental needs of both the species and the community. Whoever broke the triple undertaking given at the altar did not thereby become interesting, but an object of pity or contempt. The Roman Catholic synthesis was intended to harmonize fire and water, as alike in Scripture and in the Fathers it was possible to find thoroughly contradictory theories regarding the holiness of procreation, the law of the species, and regarding the holiness of virginity, the law of the Spirit. The Old Testament, for example, deems a numerous progeny the sign of election, whereas St. Paul says that it is good for a man not to touch a woman, even if he also says that it is better to marry than to burn. The heresy, which was bound up from the beginning with the Cortesia of the south of France, condemned Catholic marriage on each of the three heads just mentioned. It denied that marriage was a sacrament, declaring its sacramental character to be established by no single unambiguous text in the Gospel. According to Father B. M. Lavaud, the Roman Catholic sacrament is open to being justified by the account of the miracle at Cana. Quote, a mere hypothesis, end of quote, he says, however. By the passage in which Jesus states that what God has joined man must not be put asunder. Or finally, by the conversations between the risen Jesus and his disciples regarding the kingdom of God, quote, which the evangelists in the Acts mention, but do not describe in detail, end of quote. Father Lavaud points to nothing more substantial than these three hypotheses, a ground for attributing to the traditional dogma of biblical authority. Vide his article in Etudes Carmelitanes, April 1938, page 186. It declared procreation to be the work of the Prince of Darkness, the demiurge who, in its view, had created the visible world. It sought to destroy a social order which could countenance and demand war as a manifestation of the collective will to live. The Gnostics, e.g. Carpocrates, often asserted that crimes are a tribute paid to life. But the mainspring of its triple rejection of marriage was in reality a doctrine according to which love is the divinizing eros, everlastingly in anxious conflict with the fleshly creature and this creature's enslaving instincts. Accordingly, the appearance of the passion of love was bound radically to transform the attitude to adultery. Doubtless, unalloyed Catharist doctrine never condoned the fault per se. On the contrary, it prescribed chastity. But as I have pointed out earlier, inextricable misunderstandings were produced by the courtly symbol of love for the lady, obviously a kind of love incompatible with marriage in the flesh. To an uninitiated reader of the Provençal poems and Arthurian romances, Tristan was no doubt guilty of a fault in committing adultery. But at the same time, the fault took on the aspect of a splendid experience more magnificent than morality. What for Manichaeans was a dramatic expression of the struggle between faith and the world thereupon became for such a reader an ambiguous and searing poesy, and this poesy was seemingly altogether secular. Its seductive power was intensified by the reader's own ignorance of the mystical significance of its symbols, for he supposed these to point merely to some vague and pleasing riddle. Only thus can we account for the fact that in the 12th century an adulterer or adulteress suddenly became somebody interesting. King David, in lying with Bathsheba, was held to have committed a crime and to have made himself into an object of contempt. But when Tristan carries off Iseult, his deed turns into romance, and he makes himself into an object of admiration. What had hitherto been a fault, and what could only give rise to edifying remarks on the perils of sin and on remorse, now became in symbol something mystically virtuous, and later on was degraded in literature into a disturbing and alluring entanglement. I do not want directly to suggest that the present breakdown of marriage is simply the latest aspect of the discord between a medieval heresy and orthodoxy. The heresy as such exists no longer, and if orthodoxy does still exist, it must nevertheless be admitted no longer to play a direct part in the lives of our contemporary societies, to the formation of which it contributed so much. In my opinion, the present general demoralization reflects a confused strife in our lives as a result of the coexistence of two moral systems, one inherited from religious orthodoxy but no longer sustained by a living faith, the other derived from a heresy of which the, quote, in essence lyrical, end of quote, expression has come down to us in a form altogether profaned and therefore distorted. On the one hand, we have today a morality concerned for the species and the general well-being of society, though nonetheless bearing some impress of religion, what are called middle-class morals. On the other hand, there is a morality spread among us through our literary and artistic atmosphere and general culture, and this produces passionate or romantic morals. The whole of middle-class youth in Europe was brought up to regard marriage with respect, and yet at the same time all young people breathe in from books and periodicals, from stage and screen, and from 1,000 daily allusions, a romantic atmosphere in the haze of which passion seems to be the supreme test that one day or other awaits every true man or woman, and it is accepted that nobody has really lived till he or she, quote, has been through it, end of quote. Now, passion and marriage are essentially irreconcilable. Their origins and their ends make them mutually exclusive. Their coexistence in our midst constantly raises insoluble problems, and the strife thereby engendered constitutes a persistent danger for every one of our social safeguards. In bygone times, it fell to the myth to restrain this latent lawlessness and to fit it symbolically into moral categories. The myth provided an outlet and operated to the benefit of civilization, but it came about that the myth was abased and profaned, together with the formal modes which had furnished its physical embodiment. If it were now to strive to rise into existence again, we know that no powers of resistance would be strong enough to serve as its mask and excuse. Every month sees a flood of articles and books about the breakdown of marriage. They are not in the least likely to settle the problem, for only the myth, that is to say our unawareness, could bring about in behalf of passion a kind of modus vivendi, in making us more keenly alive to the problem these articles and books contribute, on the contrary, to hampering the elaboration of a settlement. They are themselves evidence of the breakdown and signs also of our inability to repair it with things as they are. For the institution of marriage was founded on 3 sets of values which subjected it to compulsions, and it was precisely in the effect and interaction of these that the myth achieved expression. But today the compulsions have been either relaxed or abandoned. There were, in the first place, sacred compulsions. Pagan races have invariably made marriage the subject of a ritual, vestiges of which long survived in our own customs. The ritual covered the purchase, abduction, and exorcism of the bride. Nowadays, owing to economic uncertainties, dowries, even on the continent, have lost importance. The customs derived from nuptial abduction now only live on as rustic practical jokes. In France, no longer does a mother call on the parents of the girl whom her son wishes to marry and formally ask for her hand. Nowhere now is a betrothal very often the occasion for a lawyer's presence at a full-dress reception, and few couples feel any superstitious need of having their union blessed by a priest. There were, in the second place, social compulsions, but today considerations of rank, blood, family interests, and even money are receding into the background so far as democratic countries are concerned, and hence the mutual choice of a marriage partner tends more and more to depend on individual circumstances. That is why divorce is steadily on the increase. Likewise, epithalamial ceremonies have either been greatly simplified or else are dispensed with altogether. Customs of remote and sacred origins, such as that of the semi-publicity of the nuptial bed, the waning of the Middle Ages, were kept up in the French provinces right into the 17th century. The original mystery had been forgotten, but the ritual continued to give weddings their social character and to fit them into the life of the community. But in the 18th century, the ceremony of bedding the bride had already become nothing more than an occasion for mild and picturesque gallantries. Nowadays, the honeymoon, to the extent that it survives and retains any significance, must be held to indicate a wish for escape from habitual social surroundings and an insistence on the private nature of what is called wedded bliss. There were, finally, religious compulsions, but the modern mind, insofar as it is still able to distinguish between Christianity and sacred and social compulsions, recoils from it with horror. For a religious vow is taken for time and eternity, which means that it makes no allowance for temperamental vagaries, alterations of character, and changes in taste and external circumstances, such as every couple must expect to experience. And it is on there being no such ups and downs that modern couples make what they call their happiness depend. I shall return to this presently. From such a general decay of institutional obstructions, a slackening of tension was bound to ensue, so that it is no wonder that there is now a vast confusion. Adultery has become a topic either for delicate psychological analysis or else for facetious jokes. Did you know the word facetious has all the vowels in it in order? A, E, I, O, U. And if it's facetiously, it has the Y. Fidelity in marriage has become slightly ridiculous. It is so conventional. Strictly speaking, the two hostile moral systems are no longer in conflict, and hence no myth is any longer possible, but are approaching a state of mutual neutralization, which will be reached when the old values, not transcended but abased, have finally dissolved. 2. The modern notion of happiness. Now that marriage has ceased to enjoy the safeguards of a system of social compulsions, the only possible basis on which it can rest is individual choice. This means actually that the success of any given marriage depends upon an individual notion of the nature of happiness, which at best may be assumed to be identical in the minds of both parties. And yet, if in any event it is perplexing enough to define happiness in general, definition becomes impossible when account has to be taken of the contemporary wish to control one's own happiness, or, what doubtless amounts to the same thing, to be able to experience the ingredients of one's happiness and to be able to analyze them and roll them over the tongue so as to give here and there a neat pat of improvement. Your happiness, it is being asserted from the pulpits of magazines, depends on this or on that, and this or that is invariably something that must be acquired, usually for cash. The consequence of this propaganda is that we are obsessed by the notion of a facile happiness, and at the same time are rendered incapable of being happy. For everything thus suggested introduces us to a world of comparisons in which, until there are men like gods, no happiness can be established. Happiness is indeed a Eurydice, vanishing as soon as gazed upon. It can exist only in acceptance and succumbs as soon as it is laid claim to. For it appertains to being, not to having, as the moralists in all ages have insisted. And our own age brings no new factor to disprove them. Every wish to experience happiness, to have it at one's beck and call instead of being in a state of happiness, as though by grace, must instantly produce an intolerable sense of want. To wish marriage to be based on such happiness implies in men and women today a capacity for boredom which is almost morbid, or else a secret intention not to play fair. Perhaps it is only this intention or hope that can account for the readiness of couples to get married without believing in it. The dream of potential passion acts as a perpetual distraction to paralyze the revulsions of boredom. People are not unaware that passion is a woe, but they imagine that such a woe will be splendid and vital in a way ordinary life cannot be, and more exciting than the happy-go-lucky present. Either a resigned boredom or else passion. This is the dilemma our lives come up against as a result of the contemporary notion of happiness. In any case, this notion threatens the ruin of marriage as a social institution that is defined by its stability. It's wonderful to be in love. In the 12th century in Provence, love was regarded as a dignity. It not only imparted a titular nobility, but actually ennobled. Troubadours were raised socially to the level of the aristocracy, which treated them as equals. That is perhaps how there has been imposed on us today, through the medium of literature, the altogether modern and romantic notion that passion is something morally noble and need know no law and no custom. Whoever loves passionately is supposed to be thereby made one of an exalted section of mankind among whom social barriers cease to exist. A Cigani may carry off a princess. Cigani means gypsy in French, I think. A Cigani may carry off a princess. A mechanic marry an heiress. Likewise, a beauty queen has some hopes of becoming the wife of an earl or millionaire. This is a modern adaptation, to use a cinematographic term, such as is alone appropriate here. German films in the days of Hitlerism freely used the Hollywood plot in which a workman or chauffeur comes to deserve his employer's daughter. This is a modern adaptation, to use a cinematographic term, such as is alone appropriate here, of the theory that love is above the established social order. The profane passion is something absurd, a kind of drug, a sickness of the soul, as the ancients supposed. Everybody is ready to grant, and moralists have said so ad nauseum. But in this age of novels and films, when all of us are more or less drugged, nobody will believe it. And the distinction is capital. The moderns, men and women of passion, expect irresistible love to produce some revelation, either regarding themselves or about life at large. This is a last vestige of the primitive mysticism. From poetry to the piquant anecdote, passion is everywhere treated as an experience, something that will alter my life and enrich it with the unexpected, with thrilling chances and with enjoyment ever more violent and gratifying. The whole of possibility opens before me, a future that assents to desire. I am to enter into it. I shall rise to it. I shall reach it in, quote, transports, end of quote. The reader will say that this is but the everlasting illusion of mankind, the most guileless and, notwithstanding all I have said, the most natural, for it is the illusion of freedom and of living to the full. But really a man becomes free only when he has attained self-mastery, whereas a man of passion seeks instead to be defeated, to lose all self-control, to be beside himself and in ecstasy. And indeed, he is being urged on by his nostalgia, the origin and end of which are unknown to him. His illusion of freedom springs from this double ignorance. A man of passion wants to discover his, quote, type of woman, end of quote, and to love no other. Gerard de Nerval, in one of his poems, tells of a dream in which a noble lady appears to him in a landscape of childhood memories. Quote, she's fair, dark-eyed, and in old-fashioned clothes that in another life I may withal have seen before, and now but do recall. Without question, this is a mother image, and psychoanalysis has shown what tragic impediments that may imply, but to quote a poet is either of no value or of too much. I want to confine myself to the illusion which most people in the present century have been taught. What obsesses them far more than a mother image is, quote, standardized beauty, end of quote. Nowadays, and we are only at the beginning, a man who falls passionately in love with a woman whom he alone finds beautiful is supposed to be a prey to nerves. So many years hence, he will have to undergo treatment. Admittedly, every generation forms a standardized notion of beauty as a matter of course, even as fashion concentrates at various times on heads, bosoms, hips, or the slim lines of the open-air girl. But nowadays, our sheep-like aesthetic tastes exert a greater influence than ever before, and they are being fostered by every possible technical and sometimes political means. A feminine type thus recedes more and more from personal imponderables and is selected in Hollywood or by the state. This influence of standardized beauty is a double one. On the one hand, it preordains who shall be an appropriate object of passion, and to this extent, the object is drained of personality. On the other hand, it disqualifies a marriage in which the bride is not like the obsessing star of the moment. In short, the present so-called, quote, freedom, end of quote, of passion is a question of advertising power. A man who imagines he is yearning for his type, or a woman for hers, is having his or her private wishes determined by fashionable and commercial influences, i.e., by novelty. 4. Marrying Iseult. Now suppose that in spite of everything, a man succeeds in plumping for a particular type as his type, a type which will be a cross between what naturally appeals to him and what the cinema has taught him to like. He meets a woman of this type and identifies her. There she is, the woman of his heart's desire and of his most intimate nostalgia, the Iseult of his dreams. The title of a novel by Max Brod, Die Frau nach der Man sich Salut. The women we yearn after, of our nostalgia, supplies the best definition of Iseult. Passionate love wants, quote, the faraway princess, end of quote. Whereas Christian love wants, quote, our neighbor, end of quote. And of course she is already married, but let her get a divorce and she shall be his. Together they will experience real life. And the Tristan he nurses like his hidden demon in his bosom will wax and bloom. As regards the revelation of the myth, that is all that matters. There we have the real marriage for love of our time with passion as the bride. But thereupon the onlookers or the public display a certain uneasiness. Will the lover with all his desires gratified continue to be in love with his Iseult once she has been wed? Is a cherished nostalgia still desirable once it has recovered its object? For Iseult is ever a stranger, the very essence of what is strange in woman and of all that is eternally fugitive, vanishing, and almost hostile in a fellow being. That which indeed incites to pursuit and rouses in the heart of a man who has fallen a prey to the myth an avidity for possession so much more delightful than possession itself. She is the woman from whom one is parted. To possess her is to lose her. I'm going to reread a few of those sentences. As regards the revelation of the myth, that is all that matters. There we have the real marriage for love of our time with passion as the bride. But thereupon the onlookers or the public display a certain uneasiness. Will the lover with all his desires gratified continue to be in love with this Iseult once she has been wed? Is a cherished nostalgia still desirable once it has recovered its object? For Iseult is ever a stranger, the very essence of what is strange in woman and of all that is eternally fugitive, vanishing, and almost hostile in a fellow being. That which indeed incites to pursuit and rouses in the heart of a man who has fallen a prey to the myth an avidity for possession so much more delightful than possession itself. She is the woman from whom one is parted. To possess her is to lose her. Wow. And thereupon begins a new passion. There is a deliberate effort to renew both obstacle and struggle. The woman in my arms I must imagine as other than she is. I give her another guise. I cause her to recede in my dreams. I strive to disturb the emotional tie that is gradually being formed thanks to the smoothness and serenity of our lives, for I must devise fresh obstructions if I am to go on desiring And if I am to magnify my desire to the dimensions of a conscious and intense passion, that shall be infinitely thrilling. And only suffering can make me aware of passion. And that is why I like to suffer and to cause to suffer. When Tristan carries off Isolde to the forest, where there is nothing any longer to obstruct their union, the demon of passion sets down a drawn sword between their two bodies. Let us descend a few centuries, stepping down at the same time the whole gamut that stretches from the age of religious heroism to the drab confusion in which men and women of our own profane era are struggling. Instead of the knight's sword, it is the sly dream of the husband that comes between them. It is the sly dream of the husband that comes between him and the wife he can only continue to desire by imagining she is his mistress. The recipe was made available as early as Balzac's Physiologie du Mariage, 1828. In countless nauseating novels there is now depicted the kind of husband who fears the flatness and same old jug trot of married life in which his wife loses her allure because no obstructions come between them. I'm going to reread this paragraph. And thereupon begins a new passion. There is a deliberate effort to renew both obstacle and struggle. The woman in my arms I must imagine as other than she is. I give her another guise. I cause her to recede in my dreams. I strive to disturb the emotional tie that is gradually being formed thanks to the smoothness and serenity of our lives. For I must devise fresh obstructions if I am to go on desiring, and if I am to magnify my desire to the dimensions of a conscious and intense passion that shall be infinitely thrilling. And only suffering can make me aware of passion. And that is why I like to suffer and to cause to suffer. When Tristan carries off Isolde to the forest, where there is nothing any longer to obstruct their union, the demon of passion sets down a drawn sword between their two bodies. Let us descend a few centuries, stepping down at the same time the whole gamut that stretches from the age of religious heroism to the drab confusion in which men and women of our own profane era are struggling. Instead of the knight's sword, it is the sly dream of the husband that comes between him and the wife he can only continue to desire by imagining she is his mistress. In countless nauseating novels there is now depicted the kind of husband who fears the flatness and same old jug trot of married life in which his wife loses her allure because no obstructions come between them. Such husbands are the pathetic victims of a myth, the mystical promise of which long ago faded out. In the eyes of Tristan, Isolde was nothing but the symbol of luminous desire. His other world was the divinizing death that was to release him from terrestrial ties. So Isolde had to be the impossible, for every possible love recalls us to its bonds, reduces us to those limits of time and space without which there are no creatures, whereas the one goal of infinite love is compelled to be the divine, God, our idea of God, or the deified self. For a man whom the myth now haunts without disclosing its secret, there is no other world beyond passion except another passion, which he must pursue in another turmoil of appearances, each time more fleeting. Originally, it was of the essence of mystic passion to be without end, and that is how this passion became distinct from the throb of carnal desire. But whereas infinity in the eyes of Tristan was an eternity from which there could be no return and in which his lacerated spirit would at last dissolve, men and women today can look to nothing but the everlasting return of an ardor constantly being thwarted.